Walter Hale was 70 years old when he bought a farm for $15. Not 15,000, 15. The county clerk looked at the deed, then at Walter, then back at the deed, as if one of them had made a mistake. You understand what you're buying? Walter slid three $5 bills across the counter. I understand what $15 buys. The clerk did not smile. That place has been empty almost 9 years. I saw that. Roof leaks. I saw that too. Barn wiring hasn't been inspected in longer than I've worked here. Walter nodded. The clerk lowered her voice. And people say other things. That was the part everyone wanted to talk about. The Harper farm sat at the end of a gravel road, where the county stopped maintaining the ditches properly. 87 acres surrounded a weathered farmhouse, an old livestock barn, 2 sheds, and pasture that had spent years growing without much management. On paper, the property was worth far more than $15. The $15 sale was not its market value. It was the final transfer in a long chain of abandonment, unpaid obligations, legal cleanup, and an owner who wanted the property out of his name, but people in town had a simpler explanation. The place was haunted. Walter heard the stories before he ever received the keys. Lights appearing in the barn after the electricity was supposedly shut off. Metal gates rattling on windless nights. A hammering sound inside the walls. Dogs refusing to cross the barn doorway. And cattle back. When cattle had still lived there that sometimes refused to drink from one particular water trough, every person told the story differently. But everyone ended it the same way. Nobody stayed. Walter had spent 53 years around livestock. He had seen bulls break gates that looked unbreakable. Calves crawl through spaces too small for them. Pumps start in the middle of the night. Pipes bung. Tin roofs scream in the wind. And mice make enough noise inside a wall to convince a grown man someone was walking upstairs. Old farms made sounds. That did not make them haunted. Still, on his first evening at the Harper place, Walter understood why the stories had survived. The farmhouse felt abandoned in a way newer buildings never did. Wallpaper peeled away in long strips. Dust covered the windowsills. One upstairs door would not stay open. The barn was worse. The air smelled of rust, old manure, wet timber, and something faintly electrical that Walter could not place. He found cracked insulators, corroded fixtures, a pump room with wiring that looked older than some of the men who had warned him about the property. He touched none of it. Electrician's problem. He muttered. Near sunset. Walter brought 4 cows onto the property, not the whole herd. He had not survived 70 years by testing an unknown farm with everything he owned. The cows stepped off the trailer calmly. They investigated the fence, found the hay, walked the edge of the lot. Nothing unusual. Walter stayed until dark. No screaming animals. No mysterious figures. No ghost. Then came the sound. 3 hard knocks from inside the barn. Walter turned. Silence. A few seconds later, bang, bang. The sound traveled through the old wall. Walter stared at the building. Then he looked at the loose pipe running beneath the eave. Tomorrow, he said. Walter stopped. The cow was thirsty. He could tell from the way she came toward the water without grazing along the way. She lowered her head. Her nose came within inches of the surface. Then she froze. Walter watched. The cow stretched her neck forward, touched the metal edge with the wet part of her muzzle, and jerked backward so fast that water splashed over the side. Walter straightened. The cow stood several feet away, staring at the trough. After a moment, she approached again. Slower this time. She lowered her head, stopped before touching it, then turned away. Walter walked over. The trough contained clear water. No obvious smell. No algae bloom. Nothing floating in it. He dipped 2 fingers into the water. Cold. Normal. He looked at the cow, then at the trough, then down at the damp concrete beneath his boots. A rusted metal pipe ran from the waterer toward the pump room. Above it, old electrical conduit disappeared into the barn wall. Walter did not know what any of it meant yet, but he knew cattle. A frightened cow might run from a sound. A nervous cow might refuse an unfamiliar barn. But a thirsty animal approaching water twice and stopping at the exact same point was not a ghost story. It was a pattern. Walter backed away from the trough. He did not touch the pipe. He did not open the electrical panel. Instead, he walked to the truck, took an old spiral notebook from the glove box, and wrote his first observation about the $15 farm. Cow approaches water normally, touches trough, Yexbuck, refuses second contact. Below it, he added 3 words, find out why. Behind him, the barn knocked again. This time, Walter barely looked up. For the first time since buying the property, the strange noise was no longer the most interesting thing on the farm. The cow was. Walter tested the water before breakfast. Not with a meter. With another trough, he hauled a black rubber stock tank from the shed, set it 50 yards from the barn, and filled it from a garden hose connected to a different line. Then he let the cows choose. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. The 4 animals grazed the edge of the lot, tearing at grass that had grown too tall around the old fence posts. Walter waited. Eventually, the same cow from the night before lifted her head. She walked toward the rubber tank. No hesitation, no stopping, no staring. She lowered her muzzle and drank. Long pulls. Calmly, Walter watched the muscles along her neck move as she swallowed. Then a second cow joined her. Then a third. Within minutes, all 4 were drinking. Walter wrote in the notebook, rubber tank, normal drinking. He drew a line beneath it. Then, old metal trough avoidance. That difference mattered. The cow was not refusing the farm's water. She was refusing that trough. Walter walked back toward the barn. The old waterer sat against a concrete wall where the ground stayed damp from years of overflow. The metal edge was rusted but solid. A galvanized pipe fed into one side. Another metal line disappeared through the wall toward the pump room. Walter crouched. There were hoof marks in the mud around the trough. All at once, some nearly washed away. He could not know how long they had been there. But the pattern bothered him. There were tracks leading toward the trough. Fewer close to the edge, as if animals had approached, stopped, and turned of no really. Walter stood. He remembered one of the stories from town. Old cattle acting strange, refusing water. People saying the animals sensed something. At the time, Walter had dismissed it as one more piece of a ghost story. Now he was not so sure. Not about the ghost. About the observation. Maybe the people had remembered the right behavior and attached the wrong explanation. That afternoon, Walter brought one cow back toward the barn. He did not force her. He simply opened a temporary gate and let her move where she wanted. She walked past the wall, past the doorway, past an old feed bunk. No panic. No sudden turn. Then she reached the trough. Her pace changed. Walter noticed it immediately. Slower, head raised, ears forward. She stopped 3 feet away. That was important. The previous night, she had touched the trough once. Now she appeared to remember it. Walter stepped to the side. The cow took one more step, then another. She stretched her neck toward the water without moving her feet. Her nose hovered above the surface. She wanted the water. Walter could see that, but she would not commit to the last few inches. Not the barn, he said quietly. The cow flicked an ear. Not the water either. Walter looked at the trough. What are you feeling? He had no answer. But he had eliminated 2 possibilities. Lauter. He opened another gate that led the cows through the barn aisle. They walked through, carefully, because the building was unfamiliar. But they walked. One paused at a hanging chain. Another sniffed a wooden post. None refused the doorway. None bolted. The story that cattle would not enter the barn suddenly seemed less precise than the version people had repeated. Maybe they had avoided only certain parts of it. Walter returned to the notebook. He listed every location tied to the local stories. Water trough, pump room, metal gate, old milking area, barn wall, all clustered on the same side of the building. Then he added another detail. Concrete stays damp here. That evening, a light rain passed over the farm. Not much. Enough to darken the concrete and wet the soil around the trough. Walter came back after sunset. The cows were near the rubber tank. He watched the old trough from the barn doorway. One cow approached, stopped farther away than before, then turned without attempting to drink. Walter stared at the wet ground. Something had changed. Not the cow. Not the location. The moisture. He looked up at the conduit running along the wall, then toward the old pump room. He still had no proof, and he was not going to invent one because the pattern looked interesting. But the farm had begun giving him a map. Water, metal, wet ground, old electrical equipment, the same places people had spent years calling haunted. Walter closed the notebook. The cow had known something was wrong before he did. Now his job was to figure out what. Walter spent the next morning making a map. Not of the property lines, not of the pastures, of every place where someone had claimed something strange happened. He started with the barn. The old water trough went first, then the pump room, the metal gate beside the milking area, the back wall where people said knocking sounds came at night, an old stanchion line, a corroded light fixture above the concrete aisle. Walter marked each location in pencil. Then he stepped back. The pattern was tighter than he expected. Almost every story centered on the same half of the barn. That interested him. Ghost stories were supposed to be unpredictable. This one seemed to have boundaries. Walter walked outside. Beyond the barn, the ground changed from concrete and mud to dry soil and pasture. The cows grazed there without trouble. They crossed the open field, walked beside wooden fence posts, drank from the temporary rubber tank, rested beneath an old elm. No strange behavior, no hesitation, no panits. Whatever people claimed haunted the farm seemed to lose interest 20 yards from the building. Walter wrote, "Nothing unusual on dry pasture." Then he underlined dry. He went back inside. At the milking area, a rusted metal gate separated two narrow lanes. Walter opened it. The hinge screamed. The cows looked up from outside but did not move. He left the gate open and spread a small amount of hay beyond it. Eventually, one cow approached. She stepped onto the concrete. One hoof, then another. She walked forward normally until her shoulder brushed the metal gate. She flinched. Not violently. Just enough for Walter to see it. The cow moved sideways and continued toward the hay. Walter froze. That was the second location. Different object. Same reaction. Metal? Concrete. Moisture nearby. He did not touch the gate. Instead, he crouched and looked around. A metal post disappeared into the concrete floor. Old conduit ran above the wall. A disconnected piece of equipment still had wiring attached. The entire area looked like decades of repairs, layered on top of one another. Some wires were newer. Some were cloth-covered. Some entered junction boxes that had been painted shut years ago. Walter knew enough to know he did not know enough. That mattered. Farmers who mistook familiarity for expertise usually learned expensive lessons. He would observe. An electrician would test. By noon, Walter had added another column to the notebook. Location, animal reaction, surface, metal nearby, moisture. The old trough checked every box. The gate checked most of them. The rubber tank checked almost none. Then Walter remembered another story. A former tenant had once claimed his dog refused to enter the pump room. Walter had laughed when he first heard it. Now he stood outside the same doorway. The floor inside was damp. A metal pump housing sat against the wall. Rust streaked downward from an electrical box. The room smelled faintly metallic. Walter stayed at the threshold. He did not need another animal to prove that the room deserved inspection, but he wanted to know something else. Why had nobody connected these locations before? That afternoon, he drove into town and found Earl Benson, who had grown up less than a mile from the Harper place. Earl remembered the farm before the stories became legend. Were the cattle afraid of the whole barn? Walter asked. Earl thought for a moment. Don't remember that. The water trough? That I remember. What about the gate near the milking side? Earl's face changed slightly. Cows used to get jumpy there. Jumpy how? Wouldn't stand right. Sometimes backed up. Walter leaned forward. Did they act that way in the pasture? No. Other side of the barn? Not that I remember. Earl scratched his chin. You thinking there's something to those stories? Walter shook his head. I'm thinking there's something to what happened before they became stories. On the drive home, that sentence stayed with him. Maybe nobody had invented the haunting. Maybe they had inherited unexplained facts. A cow jerks away from a trough. Another refuses a gate. A dog avoids a pump room. Lights flicker. Pipes bung. Then years pass. Details disappear. The explanation grows. By the time Walter bought the farm, nobody remembered which exact gate or which exact trough. They remembered only one thing. The place was haunted. Walter returned before sunset. He stood where the concrete ended and the pasture began. One of the cows walked past him onto the dry ground. Another followed. Neither hesitated. Walter looked back at the barn. The line was almost absurdly clear. Inside, metall. Concrete. Water. Old wiring. Strange behavior. Outside, dirt. Grass. Cattle, acting like cattle. Walter opened his notebook and wrote one sentence beneath the map. Whatever is wrong with this farm does not follow the animals onto dry ground. Then he added another. So stop looking for something that moves. Find what stays in one place. Walter stopped asking people whether the farm was haunted. That question produced stories. He started asking what they had actually seen. The difference was immediate. The first person he visited was Mary Colton, 82, who had lived across the road from the Harper place for most of her life. When Walter mentioned the old barn, she smiled. "You bought trouble. So people keep telling me." "You hear it yet? The knocking?" Her smile widened. "That too." Walter opened his notebook. "What did you personally see?" Mary stopped smiling. That was what Walter wanted. Not what she had heard. Not what someone's cousin had claimed. What she remembered with her own eyes. She thought for a while. The cattle used to bunch up outside the milking side. All the cattle? Some worse than others. Would they refuse to enter? Not exactly. What would they do? Mary looked toward the window. They'd get close. Then stop. Sometimes one would back away. Near the gate? I think so. Near the water? Sometimes. Walter wrote it down. Then he asked, "Did this happen in the pasture?" Mary shook her head. "Never heard about that?" That pattern again. Walter visited 3 more people over the next 2 days. Their memories were imperfect. Some contradicted one another. One remembered the barn lights flickering even when nobody was inside. Another remembered a cow that refused to drink from the old trough, but drank immediately from a bucket outside. A former farmhand remembered getting a strange little sting once when he touched a metal rail with wet gloves. Walter stopped writing. Like a shock? The man shrugged. Maybe static. Maybe nothing. When? Long time ago. Rainy day? The man thought. Could have been. Walter wrote it down anyway. Not as proof. As a clue. The most useful conversation came from a former tenant named Ray. Ray had lasted only 6 months on the property. People in town said he left because he saw something in the barn. Walter drove 40 minutes to find him. Ray laughed when Walter mentioned the story. That's what they say now? What happened? I got tired of fighting the place. How? Pump problems. Lights. Cattle acting wrong. Fence issues. Never one big thing. Did you see anything you couldn't explain? Ray leaned back. I saw enough things I didn't understand. Walter waited. Ray continued. One cow would walk right up to that trough, then jerk away. Another wouldn't. Gate by the old milking area made some of them nervous. Dog hated the pump room. Light over the aisle flickered whenever the pump kicked on. There it was, not a ghost. A cluster. Walter pointed at the last detail. The light flickered when the pump ran. That's how I remember it. Every time? Wouldn't swear to it. Walter nodded. He appreciated that answer. Memory was not a measurement, but patterns could survive even when exact details did not. Why didn't you have the electrical system checked? Ray gave him a tired look. I did. What did they find? Nothing they could fix cheap. That interested Walter even more. Meaning? Old wiring. Bad grounds. Half the place had been patched by whoever owned it before me. I didn't have the money to rebuild the whole system. So you left. I had kids. Ray paused. And after I left, people decided I'd seen a ghost. Walter closed the notebook. On the drive home, the evolution of the story finally made sense. The first version had probably been simple. The cattle avoided certain places. The lights flickered. Metal gates rattled. The pump room felt wrong. Then ownership changed. Details were lost. Cattle act strangely near the waterer, became animals. Sense something. Animals sense something, became The barn frightens them. The barn frightens them became the barn is haunted. By the time Walter bought the property, the explanation had swallowed the observations that created it. That evening, he stood in the barn and looked at his map again. The old trough, the gate, the pump room, the milking side, everything still clustered around the same system of pipes. Concrete, metal, and aging electrical work. Walter wrote one sentence across the top of the page. The stories changed. The locations did not. Then he underlined it. He was beginning to understand the real danger of the word haunted. It made people stop asking better questions. Once a place was cursed, every flickering light proved the curse. Every nervous animal became evidence. Every unexplained sound was accepted instead of investigated. Walter was not interested in proving anyone foolish. Most of them had seen something real. They had simply inherited the wrong explanation. And now he had one question left before he called an electrician. If moisture was truly part of the pattern, the farm should behave differently when the ground was wet. The forecast said rain was coming that night. Walter hoped it would. It rained just after midnight. Not hard enough to flood the yard. Enough to soak the concrete, darken the barn walls, and leave a thin film of water along the edge of the old trough. Walter was outside before sunrise. He did not go to the farmhouse windows. He did not check the upstairs door. He did not wait for another knock in the wall. He went straight to the cattle. The 4 cows were standing near the rubber tank. Calm. Normal. Walter watched them drink. No hesitation. Then he opened the temporary gate leading toward the barn. He did not push them. He did not call them. He simply gave them access. 1 cow moved first. The same one that had touched the metal trough on Walter's first night. She walked across the wet ground until she reached the concrete apron. Then she slowed. Walter stayed behind her. The cow stepped onto the concrete. 1 hoof. Then another. She continued toward the trough. At 6 feet, her head came up. At 4 feet, she stopped. Walter looked at the ground. The previous day, when the concrete was mostly dry, she had approached closer. Now she would not. He wrote, after rain stops farther from trough. Then he waited. The cow stretched her neck toward the water. Her body stayed behind. She wanted to drink. That was obvious. But she refused to make the final approach. Walter moved around the barn and opened another gate, leading back toward the rubber tank. The cow turned almost immediately. She walked 50 yards, lowered her head, drank without hesitation. Walter underlined one sentence in the notebook. Thirst is not the problem. That was important. So was the next test. He scattered a small amount of hay near the metal gate in the old milking area, not touching the gate. Just beyond it, 2 cows approached. The first walked in slowly. Her shoulder brushed close to the metal post but did not touch. She continued. The second came from a different angle. Her flank made contact with the gate. She jerked sideways. Again. Not dramatically. Enough. Walter wrote it down. Vet concrete. Contact with metal. Reaction. He looked toward the roof. Rainwater still dripped from one corner. A shallow damp line ran from the pump room toward the aisle. The whole side of the barn was wetter than the dry pasture beyond it. For the first time, Walter stopped thinking of the strange behavior as separate incidents. The trough, the gate, the pump room, the wet floor. They might all be connected by something he could not see. That did not mean he knew what it was. Walter had spent too many years farming to confuse a pattern with a conclusion. Patterns told you where to look. They did not tell you what you would find. Near noon, he walked the property again. The cows crossed dry dirt normally. They passed wooden fence posts without reaction. They drank from the rubber tank. They even entered the barn aisle when the route did not force them near the metal trough or gate. That eliminated another part of the old story. The animals did not fear the building. They feared certain contact points inside it. Walter sat on an overturned bucket and opened the notebook. He wrote 4 headings. Water, metal, moisture, old electrical system. Then he drew a line connecting them. He stared at the page. A memory surfaced. More than 30 years earlier, a dairy farmer Walter knew had complained that cows would approach a waterer, hesitate, then drink poorly. At the time, the problem had not been the water. It had been electrical. Walter could not remember the exact term. Something about current where it did not belong. Something livestock noticed before people did. He looked toward the pump room. A corroded electrical box sat inside. The old water line ran beside it. Metal plumbing. Vet concrete. A pump motor. Walter felt the pieces move closer together, but he still did not touch anything. He did not grab the gate to see if it shocked him. He did not open the panel. He did not test the waterer with improvised tools. If electricity was involved, guessing with his hands was not investigation. It was stupidity. Walter returned to the truck and called the electrician whose number he had gotten in town. "I need you to look at an old livestock barn." "What's wrong with it?" Walter glanced toward the cows. "I don't know yet." "Lights out?" "Sometimes." "Breaker tripping?" "Not that I've seen." The electrician paused. "Then what makes you think it's electrical?" Walter looked at the wet concrete around the trough. "The cattle." Silence. "Then, what are they doing?" Walter answered carefully. "They drink fine from another tank. They avoid this one. They react around metal. Worse when the concrete is wet." The electrician's tone changed. "You touch any of it?" "No." "Good. When can you come?" "Tomorrow morning." Walter hung up. That night, the barn knocked twice. A light flickered once near the pump room. Walter heard both. For the first time, neither frightened him, because fear had finally been replaced by a better question. Not, "What is in this barn?" but, "What happens when an animal touches it?" The electrician arrived just after 8 the next morning. His name was Daniel Mercer. Mid-40s, quiet, the kind of man who looked at a building before he looked at the person who called him. He stood beside his truck for a moment and studied the barn. "Original service?" "Some of it." Walter said. "That means no." Walter almost smiled. Daniel walked toward the building, but stopped before touching the metal gate. "You said the cattle react here, and at the trough. Anywhere else?" "Mostly this side." "Only when it's wet?" "Worse when it's wet." Daniel nodded once. That was all. No joke about ghosts. No raised eyebrow. No dramatic conclusion. Walter appreciated that. Inside the barn, Daniel examined the conduit, the old junction boxes, the pump wiring, and the metal plumbing. He did not rush. Walter followed several steps behind. At the trough, Daniel crouched and looked at the damp concrete. "Animals ever refuse water here?" "Yes." "But they drink somewhere else?" "Immediately." Daniel stood. "Any drop in intake?" "Not enough cattle here long enough to know." "Milk production?" "Not a dairy now." "Okay." Walter watched him write something down. Then the old memory finally returned. A dairy farm. 30 years earlier, cows reluctant to drink. Mitel, Watios. A veterinarian and an electrician arguing beside a barn. And one phrase Walter had not thought about in decades. Stray voltage. Daniel looked up. "What?" "That's what they called it." Daniel did not answer immediately. Then he said, "That's one possibility." Not the answer. One possibility. Walter liked him more for saying it that way. "What exactly does that mean?" Daniel leaned against a wooden post, avoiding the metal rail beside him. "People use the term loosely. What matters is whether there's a voltage difference between 2 points an animal can touch at the same time. The trough and the floor. For example." Walter looked down. A cow drinking from the old waterer would have wet muzzle against metal. Hooves on damp concrete. 2 contact points. Daniel continued. Could come from faulty equipment, neutral problems, grounding issues, wiring faults. Could be something else entirely. You don't decide from behavior alone. Walter nodded. But behavior tells you where to look. Exactly. That sentence settled something in him. For days, Walter had been treating the cattle like witnesses. Now he understood the better word. Sensors. Not perfect ones. Not instruments. But living animals capable of reacting to conditions people might overlook. Walter walked to the rubber tank outside. No reaction there. Daniel followed him. Different plumbing? Yes. Different surface? Dirt. Any metal contact? Not much. Daniel wrote again. Walter looked back toward the barn. The old story suddenly seemed almost obvious. People had said the animals sensed something humans could not. Maybe they had. They had simply used the wrong language for it. Walter remembered the cow jerking backward from the trough, the second cow flinching at the gate, the stronger reaction after rain, not supernatural, potentially physical, potentially measurable. That was the turning point. For years, the farm had been described through stories. Now it could be described through tests. Daniel unloaded equipment from his truck. Walter stayed back. He had no interest in pretending he understood electrical diagnosis, because he had fixed tractors and fence chargers his entire life. The barn system was old, patched, wet in places, and if current was going somewhere, it did not belong. Walter wanted measurements, not confidence. Daniel began at the service, then the pump circuit, then grounding, then the waterer. He checked between contact points instead of simply asking whether a wire was live. Walter watched the process without interrupting. Once, Daniel stopped and repeated a measurement. Then he moved the lead, tested again. His expression changed. Not dramatically. Enough. Walter noticed. What? Let me finish. So Walter waited. For 20 minutes. The only sounds were the click of equipment, the hum of the old pump, and cattle moving outside. Then Daniel walked back to the trough. He checked one point, then another. He stood up. You were right not to touch this. Walter looked at the waterer. So there is voltage? There's a measurable difference where there shouldn't be one. How much? Enough that I'm not leaving it energized until I trace the source. Walter looked toward the pump room. Can it explain the cattle? It could. Not did. Could. Walter understood the distinction. The animals had given him the pattern. The meter was beginning to give that pattern a physical explanation. Daniel switched off the affected circuit and tagged it. Then he turned back toward the barn. Now we find where it's coming from? Walter opened his notebook and wrote the phrase he had finally remembered. Stray voltage. Contact voltage possible. Not confirmed source yet. Then beneath it, the cows were not afraid of the barn. They were afraid of touching it. For the first time since he bought the farm, Walter felt the mystery getting smaller. Not solved. Smella. And that was better. Daniel started with the pump. Not because he had decided it was guilty, because it was connected to too many of the places Walter had marked. The water line, the pump room, the metal trough, the damp concrete, the old milking side. Daniel shut the circuit down and checked the system section by section. Walter stayed outside the immediate work area. He watched. That was all. The first surprise came when Daniel disconnected the pump motor. The reading at the trough changed. Not to 0, but enough for Daniel to notice. He checked again. Then he walked back to the service panel. Part of it's coming from the pump circuit. Bart? Daniel nodded. There's more than one problem here. That made Walter think of Ray. Pump problems. Lights flickering. Cattle acting wrong. Never one big thing. Maybe Ray had been more accurate than anyone realized. Daniel opened an old junction box after confirming it was de-energized. Inside, the wiring looked like the history of the farm compressed into 6 inches of metal. Old conductors. Newer splices. A connection added later. Another, repaired with materials from a different era. Dust. Corrosion. Evidence that multiple people had worked on the system over decades. Daniel pointed without touching. This place has been patched. Walter looked at the wires. Can you tell who did it? No. Can you tell when? Doesn't matter. That was another thing Walter respected about him. Daniel was not interested in assigning blame, only tracing the path. He continued toward the pump room. There. The problem became uglier. Moisture had gotten where moisture should not have been. A connection associated with the old equipment had deteriorated. There were grounding and bonding issues in parts of the system. And Daniel found a fault path that could place unwanted voltage on connected metal under certain operating conditions. Walter did not pretend to understand every detail. He understood the result. A cow standing on damp concrete and touching a metal waterer could become part of a path between 2 points at different electrical potential. Not enough to produce the dramatic shock people imagined when they thought of electricity. Enough to make contact unpleasant. Enough for an animal to remember. Daniel repaired one section, isolated another, and replaced components that had no business remaining in service. Then he tested again. The reading dropped. Walter watched his face. Gone, eh? Better? Not gone. Not yet. They moved to the old milking side. The metal gate Walter had marked was electrically connected through a chain of old metalwork and equipment. Not intentionally, just physically connected in ways that had accumulated over years of additions. Daniel traced it carefully. At one point, he found an old conductor leading toward equipment that had not been used in years. The machine was dead. The connection was not as irrelevant as everyone had assumed. Daniel isolated it, tested again. This time he nodded. There. Walter looked at the meter. You found it? I found another path. Another. Again. Not one ghost. Several ordinary faults overlapping until the whole side of the barn behaved like one mysterious problem. Daniel continued testing until the system no longer showed the same unwanted difference at the contact points they had been concerned about. Then he stopped. Not because the barn was perfect. It was not. Some wiring still needed replacement. Some circuits would remain off until they were rebuilt properly. But the immediate livestock contact problem had been identified and corrected enough to test the pattern. Walter looked toward the trough. So what do we call it? Daniel packed away one lead. Bad electrical work. Walter smiled. That's less exciting than haunted. It usually is. What about the cattle? Daniel looked toward the pasture. If the voltage difference was what they were reacting to, their behavior should change now. That answer mattered. Not the meter alone. Not the story alone. The next test was the animal. Walter waited until late afternoon. He did not drive the cows toward the trough. He opened access and let them choose. For nearly 15 minutes, none came. Then the same cow from the first night walked toward the barn. Walter recognized her immediately. She approached the old trough. At 6 feet, she slowed. At 4 feet, she stopped. Walter felt his chest tighten. Memory. The animal had learned that this place could hurt. She stretched her neck, waited, then took one step, another. Her muzzle reached the metal edge. Walter held his breath. The cow touched it. Nothing. No violent jerk. No sudden retreat. She lowered her nose into the water and drank, long enough that Walter heard every swallow. A second cow approached, then another. Neither reacted. Walter looked at Daniel. The electrician did not smile. He simply said, "That's a better test than a ghost story." Walter looked back at the trough. For years, people had said the animals could sense something, humans could not. They had been right about the first half. The cattle had sensed something, but it was not a spirit. It was a physical condition no one had measured carefully enough. Walter opened his notebook and crossed out one word he had written days earlier. Posible. Beside it, he added, electrical fault confirmed. Livestock contact points corrected. Behavior changed. Then underneath, the barn wasn't haunted. It was wired badly enough to become a story. Walter returned to the barn the next morning without the electrician. He wanted to walk the place one more time. Not as a haunted farm, as a system. That changed what he saw. The old water trough was no longer just a trough. It was the point where several things met. Metal, water, concrete, plumbing, electrical equipment, moisture. A cow drinking there placed her wet muzzle against metal, while all four. Walter had walked past that arrangement dozens of times. To him, it had looked ordinary. To the cow, it had not. That was the first mystery solved. Why would a thirsty animal approach water, touch the edge, then jerk backward? Because the water was not the problem. The contact was. Walter moved to the gate near the old milking area. The second mystery. Why would cattle walk through the barn but become nervous around one particular gate? Again, the gate itself had looked harmless, but it belonged to the same network of old metalwork and aging electrical infrastructure. A cow did not need to understand voltage. She only needed to learn that touching one place felt wrong. Once was enough. That explained something Walter had almost missed. After the first bad experience, the cow had begun stopping before contact. People might have called that fear of the barn. It was not. It was memory. An animal had learned the location of discomfort and changed its behavior before touching it again. Walter wrote, reaction becomes avoidance. Avoidance becomes story. Then he walked toward the pump room. That explained the dog. People had said the dog refused to enter because animals sensed spirits. Maybe the dog had sensed something. A sound, a vibration, a smell, an electrical condition. Walter could not prove which. That detail would remain uncertain. He crossed a line through it in the notebook and wrote, "Do not claim what cannot be proved." The farm had already suffered enough from people turning incomplete observations into complete explanations. Walter did not want to make the same mistake in the opposite direction. Not every strange event had to come from the same electrical fault. The flickering light could be part of the damaged electrical system. The cattle behavior now had strong evidence behind it. But the knocking in the wall? Walter had already found the loose pipe. The gate rattling at night? Its latch had nearly half an inch of play. Wind coming around the corner of the barn could move it. The upstairs door in the farmhouse? A tilted frame and air pressure through broken window seals were enough to make it drift. The more Walter repaired, the smaller the haunting became. Not because he had found one grand explanation, because he had stopped demanding one. Court. That was the part he found most interesting. People preferred one story, one curse, one invisible presence. Reality was messier. A failing electrical system, old plumbing, loose metal, poor maintenance, animal memory, wind, water, decades of owners solving only the problem directly in front of them, individually. None of those things sounded frightening. Together, in an abandoned farm after dark, they could build a legend. Walter returned to the trough. The same cow approached while he stood nearby. She slowed slightly, not as much as before. Then she drank. Walter watched her carefully. The hesitation had not disappeared completely. The electrical fault could be corrected in a day. Learned behavior took longer. That mattered too. A repair did not erase memory instantly. The cow had to discover, through repeated safe contact, that the place no longer hurt. Over the next several days, that was exactly what happened. The first morning, she paused. The second, less. By the end of the week, she walked to the trough without stopping. Other cattle followed. Soon the old waterer looked boring. Walter liked that. Boring was what a water trough was supposed to be. He turned to the first page of his notebook. Cow approaches water normally. Touches trough. Yarksback. Refuses second contact. Then he looked at the newer entry. Drinking normally after repair. Between those two sentences was the entire story of the farm. Not a ghost being driven away. A pattern being understood. Walter closed the notebook and looked across the barn. The place had never needed an exorcism. It had needed someone willing to separate what people felt from what animals actually did. And once he did that, the haunted farm stopped being mysterious. It became repairable. Walter did not trust one good drink. Not yet. The cow that had returned to the old trough after Daniel's repair had given him something important. A result. But one result was not enough to rebuild 9 years of rumor. So Walter watched. The first morning after the electrical work, he opened the barn side exactly as he had before. Same cows. Same trough. Same gate. Same concrete. The only thing that had changed was the electrical system. One cow entered. She slowed near the trough. Walter noticed it immediately. Not fear. Memory. She had learned that this place could hurt. Now she had to learn that it no longer did. She approached, touched the metal edge, waited half a second, then drank. Another cow followed. No hesitation. By the third animal, Walter stopped watching the water. He watched their feet. Relaxed. No sudden shifting. No backing. No tense movement away from the trough. He wrote, Day 1. One cow hesitates. All drink normally, after contact. The next day, he repeated the observation. Same result. Less hesitation. On the third morning, the cow that had first jerked away from the trough walked directly to it. Walter nearly missed the moment because nothing happened. That was the point. Nothing happened. She lowered her head, drank, moved away. Another cow stepped into her place. The old waterer had become ordinary. Walter smiled. For weeks, that trough had been the center of the farm's mystery. Now it was doing the least mysterious thing possible, holding water. He moved to the milking side gate. Before the repair, 2 cows had shown clear reactions around the metal. Now Walter opened the lane again. He placed hay beyond the gate, just as he had during the earlier test. The animals approached. One brushed her flank against the post. No jump, no sideways movement, no sudden stop. Walter checked the notebook. Metal gate normal passage. Then he stood there for several minutes. Listening. The pump started. The old light above the aisle stayed steady. No flicker. The sound of the motor was still ugly. The bearings probably needed work. But ugly was different from unexplained. That afternoon, Daniel returned for a follow-up check. Walter met him beside the barn. Cattle? Drinking. Gate? Normal. Daniel nodded. Good. Walter held up the notebook. I've been repeating the same tests. That's what you should do. No guessing. No guessing. Daniel rechecked the corrected circuits and contact points. Some parts of the barn remained de-energized until further repairs could be completed. Walter did not argue. He had already learned that making an old system functional was not the same as making every part safe enough to use. When Daniel finished, Walter asked, "So is the ghost officially gone?" Daniel looked at him. "I'm an electrician." "That a no? That's me saying I bill for wiring. Not spirits." Walter laughed. Then his expression changed. "What I want to know is whether what we found is enough to explain the cattle." Daniel considered the question. "It explains the contact behavior well. The trough and gate, yes. And the fact it got worse when things were wet? That fits the pattern we measured. The dog? Can't prove it. The knocking? You already found the pipe. The lights? Some of that was electrical." Walter nodded. That answer mattered more than a dramatic one. The farm had not been haunted by one hidden force. It had been buried under several ordinary problems that nobody had separated carefully. Some could be proved. Some could only be explained plausibly. Some had nothing to do with electricity at all. Walter wrote, "Do not turn the repair into another legend." By the end of the week, the livestock side of the barn was quieter. Not silent. Old buildings were never silent. Wood shifted. Tin popped as temperatures changed. Pipes moved. Wind found gaps. But the animals no longer treated the structure like a place they needed to negotiate. They walked in, drank, passed through the gate, left. Normal behavior. Walter stood beside the trough one evening while a cow drank inches from his hand. Water ran from the corner of her mouth and darkened the concrete below. A week earlier, that wet floor had been part of the mystery. Now it was simply wet concrete. He opened the notebook and turned back to the first page. Find out why. Walter drew a line beneath it, then wrote, because something real was wrong. That was what everyone had missed. The animals had never needed people to believe in ghosts. They had needed someone to believe their behavior meant something. Once the cattle stopped reacting to the trough, Walter started fixing everything else people had called supernatural. The knocking came first. For years, neighbors said the barn made 3 hard knocks after dark. Walter had heard them himself on the first night. He waited for the sound again. Bang. Pause. Bang. Bang. This time, instead of staring into the dark, he followed it. The noise came from the west wall. An old water line ran beneath the siding, loosely secured by 2 rusted brackets. When the pump shut off, pressure changed inside the pipe. The line shifted. Metal struck wood. 3 knocks. Walter tightened one bracket and replaced the other. That night, the ghost did not knock. Next came the gate. People swore it rattled on windless nights. Walter stood beside it one evening and watched. The latch had worn oval from decades of movement. It only took a slight pressure difference through the barn aisle to make the gate move against the post. Not enough wind for someone outside to notice. Enough airflow inside the building to move loose metal. Walter replaced the latch. Another ghost disappeared. Then the upstairs door in the farmhouse. It had annoyed Walter from the first week. He would open it. Minutes later, it would slowly drift shut. People had built stories around that too. Walter set a level against the frame. The house had settled. The doorway was no longer square. At a broken window seal at the opposite end of the hall, and the old door moved whenever air pressure changed through the house. Walter repaired the seal, adjusted the hinges. The door stayed where he left it. The more he fixed, the less mysterious the farm became. But Walter refused to turn that into a new myth. He did not tell people every strange event had come from bad wiring. That would have been just another oversimplification. The cattle's behavior at the trough and gate had strong evidence behind it. The flickering light had been tied to electrical problems, but the wall knocks were plumbing. The gate was worn hardware. The door was an old house settling unevenly. One story had hidden several different failures. That realization bothered Walter more than the haunting ever had, because once people accepted the word haunted, nobody had to separate one problem from another. They stopped diagnosing. A flickering light became evidence. A nervous cow became evidence. A moving door became evidence. Every new failure strengthened the same explanation, and the stronger the explanation became, the less anyone investigated. Walter started keeping two lists. On one page, observed. On the next, explained. Under observed, cattle avoid metal trough. Gate reaction. Light flicker. Wall knock. Door moves. Pump noise. Under explained. Electrical fault at livestock contact points. Loose pipe. Worn gate latch. Settled door frame and airflow. A few items remained blank. Walter left them blank. He had learned that uncertainty was better than invention. One evening, Earl Benson stopped by. He stood in the barn entrance and listened. Quiet. Walter shook his head. No, just normal. A cow crossed behind them and drank from the old trough. Earl watched. She wouldn't have done that years ago. Maybe. You think that electrical thing was always the problem? For the waterer? Could have been for a long time. For everything? Walter looked around the barn. No. Earl seemed surprised. Walter pointed toward the west wall. Knocking was a pipe. Then toward the gate. Rattling was the latch. Then toward the house. Door upstairs was crooked. So the stories were wrong. Walter thought about that. Not exactly. Earl frowned. Walter continued. People heard the knocking. That was real. They saw cattle act strange. That was real too. They just tied all of it together because nobody knew what else to do with it. Earl looked toward the trough. And now? Now I fix one thing at a time. That became Walter's rule. Not prove the farm was never haunted. Not prove the town had been foolish. Just refuse to let one dramatic explanation replace careful observation. Over the next month, the property changed. Lights stopped flickering. The pump ran more consistently. The old barn gate stopped clattering. The cattle crossed the concrete aisle without hesitation. The farm still creaked at night. Owls still moved through the rafters. Branches still scraped the roof. The old house still groaned when temperatures dropped. But those sounds no longer belonged to one invisible enemy. They belonged to wood, metal, water, wind, animals. The farm had not become silent. It had become understandable. And Walter realized that was what had finally killed the haunting not disbelief. Explanation. By spring, people stopped asking Walter whether he had seen anything. They started asking what he was doing to the place. That was new. For months, the Harper farm had been a story. Now it was becoming a farm again. Walter repaired the water system first. Not because it was the most visible improvement, because cattle needed reliable water before anything else mattered. The old trough remained, but the unsafe electrical problems around it had been corrected, damaged components replaced. And the system tested before Walter trusted it. The cows drank there normally now. That alone changed how the barn functioned. Next came the fencing. Years of neglect had left sections leaning, broken, or buried in brush. Walter did not replace everything. He repaired what controlled livestock movement. Corners first. Gates. Weak stretches along the road. Places where cattle pressure would expose bad work immediately. Then he turned to the pasture. The land had not been ruined. It had been ignored. Some areas were overgrown. Others had thin cover where animals had once concentrated. Walter moved cattle carefully and watched recovery. He did not assume one grazing season could undo years of neglect. He rested weak sections, used stronger ones, kept cattle away from wet areas when the ground could not support them. Slow work. Unremarkable work. The kind nobody built ghost stories around. By May, the difference could be seen from the road. The barn still looked old. The house still needed paint. But cattle were moving through the property. Water was working. Gates stayed where they were supposed to stay. Grass replaced some of the bare ground around the old livestock areas. The farm had motion again. That was when people began stopping. Earl came first, then Mary, then men Walter barely knew who claimed they had always wondered what was really wrong with the place. Walter never corrected them. He had learned that memory improved quickly after the mystery was solved. One afternoon, the county clerk who had processed the $15 transfer pulled into the driveway. She stepped out and looked around. "You actually stayed." Walter leaned against a fence post. So far, she watched a group of cows walk through the barn entrance. No stopping, no sudden backing, nothing worth noticing. Which was exactly why she noticed. They used to say cattle wouldn't go in there. They said a lot of things. She looked toward the house. So the place wasn't haunted. Walter considered the question. No. What was wrong with it? He pointed toward the barn. Bad electrical work. Then the old pipe. Loose plumbing. Then the gate. Worn hardware. Then the pasture. And 9 years of nobody fixing anything. The clerk laughed. "That's it? That's enough." She looked across the property again. "For $15? Walter shook his head. "The farm didn't cost $15. She looked at him. "The paper says it did." "The paper transferred it for 15. Walter pointed at the barn roof. "That cost." "Then the fence." "That cost." "Then the electrician's work." "That cost." "Then his own hands." "And that cost too." The $15 price made a good story, but it did not make the restoration free. Walter had put money into wiring, water, fence, repairs, fuel, materials, and more hours than he bothered counting. The real advantage was not that he had acquired a valuable farm for the price of lunch. It was that fear had pushed the property so far outside ordinary consideration that almost nobody was willing to ask what remained underneath the problems. Walter had asked. The answer was simple. Land, water access, structures that could still be repaired, pasture that could still grow, a location livestock could use once the dangerous parts were corrected. The farm had been discounted not because every acre was worthless, because people no longer separated the property from its reputation. Walter walked to the old trough that evening. 2 cows stood drinking. Another waited behind them. He remembered the first night. The sudden jerk. The refusal to return. That moment had been the center of the entire legend. Now the same trough was just one small part of a working livestock system. A truck slowed on the county road. The driver leaned out the window. "Heard you fix the ghost?" Walter smiled. "No." "What'd you fix?" "Then, the farm." The truck moved on. Walter looked across the pasture. $15 had not bought him a miracle. It had bought him the right to look closely at something everyone else had already decided they understood. And once the fear was removed, the property was no longer a haunted place. People wanted to escape. It was land with problems. Problems could be priced. Problems could be tested. And some problems could be repaired. That was worth far more than $15. By the end of summer, the Harper place no longer looked abandoned. It still looked old. Walter preferred that. The barn siding was weathered. The house porch leaned slightly. The pasture fences were a patchwork of new wire, old posts, and repairs that only made sense if you knew why they had been made. But the farm worked. That was enough. One evening, Walter carried a chair outside and set it near the old water trough. The cattle were coming in slowly from pasture. One cow walked to the trough, then another. No hesitation, no pause at the metal edge, no sudden jerk backward, just water. Walter watched them drink until the light began to fade. The barn knocked once behind him. He did not turn around. He knew that sound now. A section of old siding expanded as the temperature dropped. 10 years earlier, someone might have written it into the story. Another noise, another sign, another reason to leave. Walter opened the notebook he had started on the first night. The first page was still there. Cow approaches water normally, touches trough. Yarks back. Refuses second contact. Underneath. Find out why. He smiled. That had been the entire difference. Not courage. Not skepticism. Not some special ability to see what other people could not. Just the decision to keep asking why. Walter turned through the pages. Water. Metal. Moisture. Old electrical system. Gate reaction. Rain. Pump circuit. Contact points. Repairs. Normal drinking. Each page looked ordinary. That was what made it powerful. The haunting had been built out of details. It had to be dismantled the same way. A truck pulled into the driveway. Earl Benson stepped out. He carried 2 cups of coffee. Figured you'd still be out here. Walter took one. They sat near the trough. For a while, neither spoke. Then Earl looked toward the barn. You know, people still call it the haunted farm. Walter nodded. Probably always will. You mind? No. Earl laughed. I would. Walter watched another cow drink. They weren't completely wrong. Earl turned. What do you mean? The animals did know something people didn't. Earl waited. Walter pointed toward the trough. They knew that place hurt. Then toward the gate. They knew that felt wrong. Then toward the pump room. They knew where they didn't want to stand. Earl looked at the barn. So they really were sensing something. Yes. Just not ghosts. Walter smiled. People got the observation right, and the explanation wrong. That was the part Walter had come to respect. The old stories were not pure nonsense. They were damaged records. A cow refused water. Someone remembered. A gate made animals nervous. Someone remembered. Lights flickered. Someone remembered. But as years passed, the details that could be tested disappeared. The conclusion survived. Haunted. One word was easier to pass down than 10 separate maintenance problems. Walter understood that now. Humans like stories because stories held things together. Sometimes that was useful. Sometimes it made people stop looking. Earl sipped his coffee. So what do you think would have happened if nobody sold you the place? Walter looked across the pasture. More years empty. And then, roof gets worse. Fence disappears. Water system fails completely. Eventually worthless. Walter shook his head. Eventually harder to save. That distinction mattered. The farm had never been worthless. It had been misunderstood long enough for neglect to start making the misunderstanding true. Walter closed the notebook. The cattle moved away from the trough and back toward the pasture. The old barn creaked. A bird shifted in the rafters. Somewhere inside the house. Wood settled with a dull pop. The farm was not silent. It never had been. Walter finally understood why that mattered. Silence was not proof that a place was safe. Noise was not proof that something was wrong. Animals reacting strangely did not prove the supernatural, but neither should strange behavior be ignored. Everything on a farm communicated. Water pressure, grass color, fence tension, animal movement, electrical systems, buildings. The mistake was not hearing the signs. The mistake was deciding what they meant before looking closely enough. Walter stood and carried the chair back toward the house. Earl followed. Behind them, the trough filled quietly. The gate stayed still. The barn light remained steady. At the porch, Earl looked back once. Still feels a little haunted. Walter smiled. That's because you know the story. Then he opened the door. The farm had never needed someone brave enough to fight a ghost. It had needed someone patient enough to separate rumor from evidence. And once Walter did that, the thing everyone feared became something far less dramatic. A farm with problems. Problems that could be found. Problems that could be measured. Problems that could be fixed. Everyone had said the animals could see what people could not. They were right. They had just misunderstood what the animals were seeing.